Good morning and welcome to Warwickshire Pension Fund's Academies training event. Today we're going to be talking about when you're looking to outsource services from your academy, so things like the catering and cleaning services that you have. We've got Rob Bilton from Hyman Robinson to talk about the actuarial side of things, so looking at how contribution rates are calculated and the options around those. And we also have Alistair Wickens, the team leader from the employer relations team, who deals with the process from the fund's point of view and will be your main point of contact when you do have queries with looking at these outsourcings and any admission agreements that you're going through. So just to kick off, we are a live event, so if you do have any questions, you can ask them through the Q&A function and we will pick that up at the end of the session if that's okay. So hopefully you're ready to listen and we will make this as interesting as we can. So if we can, let's have a look. We're just checking that we've got no issues with our event. We had a bit of a problem at the start, but it looks like we're okay. If you are having problems hearing or seeing us, please put it in the questions and answers and we'll make sure we pick that up and address it through the broadcast. But it is being recorded, so if you do have to nip off or something, the doorbell goes, or you get a delivery, you will have the chance to view this again as it is being recorded. So here we go. I'm a bit quick on my introduction, so Rob, if you're ready, I shall hand over to you. Thank you.
All right, okay, hopefully I've managed to master the technology there and people can see slides with the skier on. I think given today's weather, well, today's weather certainly up in Scotland is quite an apt picture because it's absolutely freezing and chucking it down. No snow yet, but it's yeah, seasons have certainly changed. So as Vicky mentioned, what I've been asked to come along today is just to talk about pensions or outsourcing. Well, just talk about outsourcing and from the pensions angle, and give a bit more background on that, bit more detail to help your understanding. And if there's any questions, happy to pick those up at the end, or if we've got dedicated time at the end of the agenda to go through those. So what I was going to cover really was very briefly.
Sorry, Rob, just to interrupt, you just need to share your screen with the slides. Alex, we've got you live at the moment.
I think he had, Alistair. I was able to see them before.
Oh, is that? Can you see? Can everybody see them now? The skier.
Perfect.
Yeah, got them now. That's right. Yeah.
Okay, right. Okay, right. Grand. So hopefully you can see an agenda slide, and just going to quickly cover sort of background to outsourcing. It's not going to go into loads of details, but really sort of because of outsourcing, why is pension funding an issue and something you need to think about when you're going through an outsourcing. Then talk about who's who in an outsourcing from a pensions point of view. Then the funding implications, and then just go on to some practical considerations for everyone on the call to think about if they're going through an outsourcing. So firstly, in terms of background for outsourcing, about why do employers outsource? And I mean, a lot of reasons. We've certainly seen the popularity and frequency of outsourcing has certainly increased in the last 10 to 15 years. A lot of outsourcing is not just academy schools doing it, we obviously have councils doing it for all sorts of different services. And I've got a list of reasons there for why an outsourcing may be on the cards, but in none of those four does pensions really come into it. It's very rare that it's for pensions reasons outsourcings take place. But when you do outsource, there are pensions implications which you need to be aware of and factor in and consider carefully. And the reason why pension costs are an issue are because of a couple of regulations that have been put in. Firstly was the Transfer of Undertakings Protection of Employment, also referred as TUPE, which came in 2006. And this legislation sought to protect employees' rights when the organisation that they're working for transferred people to different organisations, and really to ensure that the pension protection as well as other employment rights are protected during such a transfer. So this legislation affects both the outgoing employer, so the employer where people are leaving, and the income employer where people are coming into. And specifically for pensions in the LGPS, this legislation sits alongside other legislation and guidance set by the government to ensure that any member from a public sector pension scheme or a public sector employer has their pension rights protected when they transfer employment because of an outsourcing. And for yourselves, for Academies, that sort of alongside legislation is called New Fair Deal. Sometimes just referred to as Fair Deal, but there was a previous incarnation of this back in 1999. But New Fair Deal was implemented in October 2013. Really sought to simplify the old version of Fair Deal, but it covers central government departments and including academies. And really, the headline takeaway from New Fair Deal for yourselves is that when you outsource a service, whoever you outsource it to, the winning contractor or bidder, they must offer continued access to the current public sector pension scheme for those members transferring. So if you're transferring catering or cleaning staff, for example, to a contractor, then the contractor must continue to offer access to the LGPS for those members. Okay, so and that is why, because of that legislation, that is why pensions funding is an important aspect of any outsourcing for you to consider. So if you're going through an outsourcing, I think just talk about the stakeholders and their roles through an outsourcing, again from a pensions funding point of view. And we've got three main stakeholder groups. Firstly, obviously, we've got the letting authority, sometimes, and that's effectively the academy, the multi-academy trust, who is awarding the contract, who is running the outsourcing. Sometimes the letting authority is also referred to as the awarding authority, for this simple purpose that they're awarding the contract. Then in the second stakeholder, we have the administering authority, and that's really the pension fund, that the staff currently participate within. So for yourselves, it'd be Warwickshire Pension Fund, and the administering authority is Warwickshire County Council. And we can have the situation if the county council is outsourcing, where the county council is both the letting authority and the administering authority, but they're run by two sort of separate groups of people in the council, and it's all set up to be independent of one another. But yeah, so you've got the pension fund, and then the third party is obviously the winning contractor or bidder for the outsourcing services, where those staff are going to, which employer that is. So just taking each one of those three groups in turn and thinking about what's their role in an outsourcing. So the letting authority, yourselves, again, I talked about fair deal guidance, so using that as it applies to yourself. And really, I think the key role is ensuring that all the pensions issues are considered before the tender process, and get in contact with the fund, with the administering authority, as soon as sort of discussions are underway about a potential outsourcing. I think one thing to take away from today is that early engagement with the pension fund is key to managing the pensions aspects of an outsourcing and make sure that they're a success and avoid any problems down the line. And as well as engaging with the pension fund, obviously you will need to be engaging with staff and any trade unions that may come into the mix. And crucially in this is assessing and understanding sort of the financial pension risks and costs. So if an outsourcing and the staff continue to have access to the LGPS, then the winning bidder, the contractor, will have to pay monies towards the pension fund to provide those pensions, and it's likely that those costs will be included in their contract price, the price that you're having to pay them to take on the service. So understanding the costs and understand the risks associated with it helps you have a good idea to also check, has the contractor actually, realistically priced these costs in? There's not going to be any hidden surprises later on and say, well, we weren't aware of that, you didn't tell us about that, so we need to change the commercial arrangement or anything like that. So it's crucial that you also understand the pensions risks and costs associated with any particular outsourcing. From the administering authority's point of view, their role is really they're responsible for the terms of the admission agreement. I think come on to talk about what that is later, but when you transfer an outsource to another employer, that employer has to join the pension fund, and they join the pension fund via a legal agreement called the admission agreement, and set up as an admission body. And it's the administering authority's role to ensure that they're happy with the terms of the admission agreement, and also that they're there to protect the fund and the other fund employers from any outsourcing potentially causing other fund employers extra pensions costs. That's their role. So, but they're not there just to protect the other employers. They're also there to support yourself, the academy, who's outsourcing the contract during this, to help guide you through that. So really it's a holistic service, a holistic overview and role that the administering authority has in this process to help all parties in the pension fund involved. I think the third point is an important one to understand, that it's the administering authority's final. The administering authority has the final decision whether to let an employer into the pension fund. It's an admission body. It's an admission agreement, and the administering authority has to sign it to let them in. And to do that, they have to make sure that everything is in line with the LGPS regulations. Again, for the purpose of protecting both yourselves as the academy and the other employers in the pension fund, and they help oversee the new employer admission process, as it very much say, sort of help guide you and the winning contractor through that. And then the third party, that winning contractor, their role in amongst this is really to, well, make sure that they're priced in the correct pensions costs into their bid, so they're not going to cause themselves problems later on. We're going to talk about this a bit later, but they may have to secure a bond or a guarantee just to allow them participate in the fund. This is one of the risk management and routes that the fund takes to help protect the other employers in the fund. And also ensure that they provide the information that the administering authority requests, and provide it on time. Timing is crucial in an outsourcing as well. And they are also will be required to complete any discretionary statements around employment policies, etc., as and when the fund, the administering authority requires. But all that information will be helped guided by the administering authority and via you as the letting authority during this process. So so that's the sort of the key stakeholders in the process. Just moving on to the pension funding implications themselves. I'm just going to sort of go slowly through this, because I think this is the important bit. This is probably the bit where I've been asked to come here today. And when we think about pension funding for outsourcings, there's two factors that are driving why this is an important thing, an important aspect for the letting authority to think about. So firstly, on the left-hand side of these slides, this slide, what I've got here is we talk about the Warwickshire Pension Fund as a legal entity. There is just one fund, but actually the fund is made up of hundreds of different individual employers. You yourself are one of these employees. You've got the councils, you've got other contractors, you've got charities. So there's all sorts of these different employers in the fund. And what the fund does, and help the fund do, is track each employer's individual position in the fund, so their share of the fund's liabilities and assets. And we track and monitor those to make sure that each employer is responsible and is only paying for their portion of the fund. So although there's just one big fund and we always talk about the fund, actually what really is going on, the fund is just an aggregation of hundreds of smaller pension funds, and each one of those pension funds is for each individual employer. So that's what this lovely picture on the left hand side is trying to show here. So when you outsource a service to a contractor, because they have to provide access to those members that are transferring, they join the pension fund as another employer. So for example, say employer A outsourced, then we'd end up with an employer E in here, and that would be, and then employer E would be responsible for their share of the fund. And secondly, typically in the LGPS, when a member moves from one employer to another, they transfer all their accrued benefits. So it's not like, so if they had 10 years of service, or they'd say they'd accrued £5,000 of pension from service in employer A, and then they moved and started employer B, it's not like then we would start a separate record and track to see how much accrued pension under employer B. All that service transfers with them. And typically what happens in an outsourcing is that the assets equal to a member's liabilities transfer. And I've got an example here. So we've got member X, they're moving from employer A to employer B. At the time of the transfer, they've got an accrued pension of £5,000. All that past service that they've worked for and earned in the LGPS entitles them to a pension of £5,000. We calculate that actually that means there's a liability value, so the amount of money that we need to hold today to pay out that pension of £5,000 in the future from retirement until death is £90,000, and therefore we will transfer £90,000 of assets from employer A to employer B. This is all notional within the fund. It's not like there's a physical transfer going between different bank accounts, all notional, but it's within our tracking, within the fund's tracking systems, that money, those assets and liabilities move from employer A to employer B. And the reason why we transfer, why it's standard practice in the LGPS to transfer all the past service across is, firstly, from an administration point of view, it's simpler. It just keeps one record for one member, or one record for that job that member's doing. And secondly, the value of a member's accrued pension can be affected by things like salary increases, or whether a member retires early or goes on ill health, and those decisions are controlled by the employer that the member is currently with. So it would seem unfair for the old employer to have their liabilities and their funding affected by a decision from the new employer normally. So that's why we have that process. So these two factors mean that we do have, when we have an outsourcing, bearing in mind that we have a new employer joining the fund as a result of an outsourcing, and typically we have assets and liabilities transferring, but it does mean we have a couple of options available for managing the pension funding aspect of an outsourcing, and who pays what effectively, and who's exposed to what pensions risks during the duration of the contract. And what we've got is we've got two routes. Route one is sort of what we call the traditional agreement, and that's really the route that has been taken place since outsourcing's really started in the LGPS and started picked up pace over the last few years. That's been the route of choice that people have gone down to. But then we've also now got a second route which is coming hot on its heels, and that's pass through. And that is really taken off over the last 4 or 5 years for a couple of reasons, which I'll come and talk about later. So we've got this new route pass through, and actually this route is now becoming very popular. In fact, some LGPS funds now mandate it as the route of choice. We're going to talk about from a Warwickshire pension view. We haven't gone down the route of mandating it, but it is the preferred route now instead of the traditional arrangement, and just explain each of these routes in detail and what it means, and hopefully you can understand why that is the case, why route 2 is now preferable to route 1. Oh, just going to talk through route 1 and take a bit of time talking through this slide because there's a lot on it. It's a busy slide, but what I've got here really is a timeline from when, if you outsource them, from when the contractor, that winning bidder, joins the fund to the point that they leave the fund. So under route 1, under this traditional agreement, when the contractor joins the fund, so say the contract start date is 1st of January, so on the 1st of January, the contractor joins the fund via an admission agreement. At that point of joining, all the members who are in scope of the outsource and who are transferring from the academy or from the MAT to the new contractor, all their liabilities and assets will transfer to the contractor. Again, notionally, but in the tracking system for the fund, they will transfer and they'll be fully funded at outset. So say there's £1 million of liabilities transferring across, then £1 million of assets will go across to the contractor. So they're starting in the pension fund fully funded at the date of joining. And also we calculate a contribution rate for this contractor, and that's based solely on the membership that have transferred to the contractor. So it might be different from the contribution rate that the letting authority that use an academy is paying, because we've got different so the letting authority's contribution rate will be based on all their members, whereas the contractor's contribution rate will just be based on the members transferring. So you might have a different contribution rate for that reason. And also there might be different funding strategy in place for a contractor. The two key ones is if the contractor is viewed as higher risk, then you might need some more prudence in the funding plan, and that's something that's discussed in the run-up to them joining. It's not a decision made there and then, it's something discussed, and the fund will speak to you and speak to the contractor to understand. And also the time horizon, because the contractor only stays in the pension fund for as long as the contract is in place. So that could be 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years. But what we're aiming to do is set a funding strategy that ensures that at the end of their contract period, that employer is still fully funded. And a difference in time horizon can result in a difference of contribution rate, because most of you as academies will have a time horizon of 19 years, because you're in this fund forever under the regulations as they stand. So at joining, contractors fully funded, they're responsible for all the assets and they're responsible for all the liabilities, they're joined fully funded, and they've got their own contribution rate, and that's what's then paid to the pension fund by the contract, and it may differ from what you as the letting authority pay. Now, during participation in the pension fund, the contractor is exposed to all pension funding risks. So the fund's investment returns, because they're not guaranteed, the fund's invested in things like equities and properties which fluctuate and go up and down, and future expectations of what return we can get from those assets also change depending on wider economic factors. And those things will affect both the value of the assets and the value of the liabilities. So we can see the employer's funding position fluctuate. So it might start off fully funded, but during their participation, there might be more than fully funded, or there might be less than fully funded, just depending how those risks have occurred, and things like membership experience as well. So, for example, in the LGPS, the ill health protections are good for members. If a member needs to retire due to ill health, and it's severe ill health, what we call a tier 1 ill health, then they get awarded full prospective service and can take their benefit immediately. So whilst that's good for the member, that really increases the cost of providing these pensions, so increases the liabilities. But we don't have sufficient assets, accrued already to pay for that. So that strain occurs, and that can weaken the funding position. So all these different risks affect the contractor's funding position in the fund. And what might happen is during the participation, if the contractor's in long enough, then they may be in during when one of the triennial valuations of the fund happens. So every 3 years, the pension fund is valued. And during that valuation process, we review every employer's position in the fund and reassess the contribution rates and makes any tweaks and changes as necessary. So the contractor's contribution rate, say they were paying 20% of pay when they joined, may get to a valuation, and we may reassess and say, well, actually, we think they now only need to pay 17% of pay or 24% of pay. So we've got fluctuation there. So uncertainty that the contractor needs to be aware of and needs to allow for. And the next formal valuation of the fund is at March 2022. I'm sure you'll be hearing more about that over the coming months. So it's March 2022, and the next one after that's March 2025. So we've got fluctuation there during participation, and then when at the point of leaving, so the contractor leaves the pension fund at the end of their contract period. Effectively, they're not providing the service to you anymore. The staff that are working for the contractor will come back to you as the letting authority. Now, I know you might then relet the contract to another provider, but this is, in terms of this contract, this admission agreement, the staff are coming back to you. So this contractor is leaving the pension fund at the end of the contract. I have got an asterisk there because there can be situations where the contractor leaves the fund before the end of the contract period. For example, if the contractor becomes insolvent, or if there are no more active members under the contractor who are members of the LGPS, say all those members who joined, who are active members of the LGPS, if they retire or leave, for example, then at that point, when there's no active members left, then that's the trigger point in the pension in the LGPS as well for the cessation for the contractor to leave the fund. But at some point they will leave the fund, and then we need to carry out a cessation valuation of the liabilities and assets. And what we're doing is just looking at the funding position of the contractor at that date. And if the contractor is in deficit, if the liabilities exceed the assets, then the contractor will need to make a payment to make good that position. So to make it back to fully funded, because those liabilities and assets are coming back to you as the letting authority, you will be responsible for those going forward. So you've come to the contractor fully funded when they joined from your share of the fund. Now they're coming back to your share of the fund fully funded as well. So if they're in deficit, that's what happens. If they're in surplus, so if they've got an excess of assets over liabilities, from May 2018, the LGPS regulations were changed, and now the contractor may receive an exit credit, so they may receive the value of that surplus. So historically, previously, if there was any surplus, that would remain in the pension fund. The employer couldn't get access, the contractor couldn't get access to it, so it would effectively come back to you as the letting authority. Now, the contractor may receive the exit credit. I've put may there because there are some provisions in the regulations where the pension fund, when carrying out a cessation valuation, can have regard to some items such as any risk sharing agreements in place, and what's the reason for that excess. In that, the value of the contributions that have been paid by the contractor, really to try and give the letting authority a bit of protection as well. But in most cases, the surplus is likely to be paid. And if the contractor is in deficit and they can't make that payment, they can't repay the cessation debt for whatever reason, then it would fall on yourselves as letting authority, really, as the guarantor, of the contractor to make good that payment. So that's the sort of timeline of the traditional agreement. That's how it operates. And just when thinking about that, as with anything in life, there's always pros and cons. There's no perfect solution. There's no sort of watertight. That solution is perfect in every way. From looking at the traditional agreement, looking at the pros. Firstly, as the letting authority, you're passing all the funding risks onto the contractor. All those funding risks are effectively coming off your books and they're going on to the contractor. So there's less risk there. And the contractor will be paying for their own liabilities, no membership experience. So the contractor makes a decision that affects, the staff and their remuneration, or a member for early retirement, for example, then the contractor is directly paying for that. I think currently at the moment, I think it might be fair to say that probably is a better understanding by bidders and other advisors, for example, legal advisors, of this route, because it has been used for the past 10 or 15 years as sort of the standard. So do you see people are maybe more comfortable with this route? But I think that point is quickly flipping the other way now to the route 2, which we'll come on to talk on. From the cons, from the disadvantages of this route, hopefully you took away when I was talking through that time, there's a lot of uncertainty around what the contractor will be paying for pensions costs during their time in the pension fund. The contribution could change during participation if experience is poor, poor investment returns, etc. And they may want, and they also don't know what the cessation valuation will be at the end of their participation. Will they have one to pay, and how much it will be? So that bigger uncertainty is likely to mean that the contractor will put a higher margin into their bid price for pensions costs, because there's more uncertainty around that. Certainly a provider who understands the risks and pension risks that they're taking on, that would probably be what they would end up doing. So that would lead to higher outsourcing costs for yourselves as the letting authority, higher contract values. Equally, if the employer doesn't understand that, so they might not be pricing it inappropriately into the contract, so you're not getting those higher costs. But what we have seen in the past is a contractor not being aware of these costs and at least the problems later on. For example, that they can't pay a cessation valuation, or they weren't aware of it and haven't reserved for it, and then they run into funding difficulties and trigger insolvency, etc. And then it falls on you really as the letting authority, as the guarantor, to make it good, sort of pick up the pieces, as it were. And thirdly, under this route, there is more administration and costs for all the parties throughout the contract life cycle. If you think about it, at the start, we need to calculate the value of the assets and liabilities going to the contractor, what the contribution rate is. Then during the participation, keep monitoring that position, calculate a new rate, and calculate a cessation valuation. So just from the actuarial side, like my side, it's a lot of work and there's costs involved with that. And then on the pension fund side, obviously relaying that information and discussing it with yourself takes up obviously time and has cost associated with it yourselves. And even for you as letting authority, engaging with that and understanding with that, and dealing with any impact it might have on the commercial arrangement as well. So that was a route 1. Under route 2, so this route 2 is now called pass-through. And really this route came about to try and simplify the administration and participation of contracts in the LGPS. I think the final point I made there under route 1, route 1 was okay when there's maybe just a few outsourcings, where outsourcings were quite rare and they're normally just being driven by councils and the sort of one-offs. But what we've seen is just an explosion of outsourcings, both from councils and from academies as well. So we now have a lot of outsourcings to deal with, and it's a lot of administration, a lot of costs. So this route 2 is a simpler approach to it, which helps manage that increased frequency. And especially what we saw sometimes, historically, outsourcings were going to big nationwide firms who had very sophisticated pension functions. They knew, they had people dedicated to managing pension risks of outsourced contracts. again, seen a lot more outsourcings go to sort of smaller businesses, one or two man bands who, with the best will in the world, are never going to be able to fully engage and understand some of the risks of participating in the LGPS as a big multi-employer defined benefit pension scheme. And the other trigger for this was the introduction of exit credits, what I talked about back in May 2018, this legislation that came in, which then saw surpluses being paid back to contractors, and some people feeling a bit uncomfortable with the idea of pension fund money going out to contractors. I'm not saying that's it's a bad thing. The contractor is on the risk, is on the hook for if there's a deficit, they have to make good the payment. But if it's in surplus, it's you may see it's fair that they get the benefit of that. But there were some people who said there is a risk that people could use this for ulterior means as some way of avoiding tax by putting excess funds into the pension scheme and then getting it back as an exit credit, and not having to pay corporation tax, etc. on it. But all these different options, but that really is starting to increase the popularity of pass-through. And what pass-through does, it limits the contractor's exposure to pension funding risks. And I'll talk through the timeline again to help you understand what that means. And there's a lot less uncertainty attached to the pensions cost for the contractor during their participation in the LGPS. And for these reasons, this is now Warwickshire Pension Fund's preferred option for all outsourcing. So when you're thinking about outsourcing and engaging with the pension fund, this would be the route that would prefer how the outsourcing would occur in terms of the pensions aspect of the agreement. So just again going through the timeline similar to route one, but how it varies from a traditional agreement. So in pass-through, when the employer joins the fund, again, they're joining the fund via an admission agreement. We still need to have that in place. They still need to be, still have to have an admission agreement to be able to be in the fund. But at this point, no liabilities or assets transfer to the contractor. We keep those liabilities and assets with you, the letting authority. Okay. And the contribution rate that the contractor pays is equal to the letting authority, so your primary rate. The primary rate is a technical term in the LGPS regulations. It means the cost of future benefit accrual. And if you're thinking, what is my primary rate? When your valuation results were communicated to you, and you would have got a result schedule, on that there would have been a table which sets out the contribution rate payable for the years up to the next valuation, and that would be split between primary rate and secondary rate. So the primary rate is just the cost of future benefit accrual. It's also set out in the rates and adjustment certificate in the fund's valuation report, which is available on the fund's website. But that is what the contribution rate payable by the contract will be. So a lot of upfront certainty then. Now, during participation, then what happens if the letting authority's primary rate changes? Then so does the contractors, and it's still pegged to the primary rate. So that's the only fluctuation in the rate. And because you're generally long-term employers and we're not expecting much change in your risk profile, we expect primary rates to stay relatively stable, but there could still be movement in it. But if there is, then the contractor's contribution rate would change in line with that. But the bigger things driving it, for example, what talked about in route one, if there's, investment under or over performance, or poor membership experience, for example, or, future inflation expectations are higher, which affect the value of liabilities and assets. Those risks don't affect the contribution rate that the contractor pays. It stays with you, the letting authority, to fund those. So the quid pro quo is the contractor is not exposed to those risks, but they get more certainty in what they're paying. There may be situations, depending on commercial terms in the agreement with the contractor, where the contractor may have to pay for pension costs that they control. For example, salary increases, if they award really high excessive salary increases, because some of the benefits in the LGPS are still linked to final salary. If you award higher than expected salary increases, then that increases the liabilities. So some employers put a clause in the commercial arrangement and say that the contractor will be liable for those excessive salary increases, and sometimes early retirements as well. If a contractor makes someone retire early and there's a strain associated with that, it'll be for the contractor to pay for that, not for the letting authority. But really, there's no other sort of pension funding risk exposure for the contractor. And then at the point of leaving, when we get to the end of the contract period, pretty much there's no cessation valuation. That the contractor leaves and they walk away from the fund, so long as they've paid all the contributions that they should have paid. Comes with that proviso, but they're not on the hook to make sure that the assets and liabilities associated with their members are fully funded, and they walk away, and the funding risk is retained with the letting authority. And just again going through the pros and cons of this route. So pros, more clarity for all parties over the contribution rate in the terms of participation. So you're going to have lower uncertainty margins in bid prices from contractors, which means you're effectively not paying a risk premium or uncertainty premium in when outsourcing. And it is far simpler for all parties, including yourselves as letting authority, to administer, and there's lower contract life cycle costs, which again would reduce the cost of outsourcing. The cons to it is because you're not passing the pensions risk over to the contractor for that period of participation, you remain exposed to the funding risks for those members. And you could potentially pay for some of the contract decisions that impact on liabilities. It talks about excessive salary growth, but there are risk mitigation options available, which I mentioned there. So that's all I would say about the pension funding implications. So we've got route 1, route 2, and route 2 pass through is the simpler and the more preferred way. And as I said, a lot of LGPS funds are now mandating that as the only way that outsourcings can work, because it is preferable for all parties. Warwickshire Pension Fund still have a choice, but it certainly is the way that the fund would prefer yourselves to operate any outsourcings. The final bit from myself is just to talk about some of the practical considerations around outsourcings. Firstly, in terms of risk management, and alluded to this earlier on about the LGPS regulations actually place a requirement to ensure that there's appropriate risk management and mitigation solutions in place against a contractor insolvency. And that specific risk that the contractor becomes insolvent during their participation, and if there's a funding deficit, then there's nobody in the pension fund to pick it up, and then it will fall to all the other scheme employers to pay for it. And there's two main routes sort of set out in the LGPS regulations to mitigate that. Firstly, that the contractor secures an indemnity or bond, basically an insurance arrangement from an insurer or a bank. That says if they become insolvent, then this indemnity bond will pay out, and that should plug any funding deficit in the pension fund. And as with any insurance, then the contractors effectively pay an insurance premium to the provider to do that. The second option is that the letting authority provides a guarantee, which basically says if that's the case, if the employee becomes insolvent and there's a deficit, then the letting authority will guarantee the funding position. So that's either we'll come in and make good the payment to make back to fully funded, or we'll take back on the assets and liabilities for the contractor, and we'll continue to fund those alongside all our other liabilities and assets for the staff that we've retained control of, and put that into our funding position and our funding plan. How these two options really play out under pass-through, by the nature of the pass-through, the letting authority is the guarantor. Because there's no assets or liabilities transferring to the contractor, there's no need for an indemnity or bond. The letting authority is implicitly guaranteeing the assets and liabilities of the in relation to the pensions costs of the contractor. One point of note, academies, in terms of participation in the LGPS, are ultimately guaranteed by the Department for Education. They have provided a guarantee to all the LGPS funds that say if an academy becomes insolvent and they can't pay their own assets and liabilities and the academy can't be rebrokered with another MAT, then the DFE will step in and make a payment to the pension fund. If the academy is guaranteeing a contract, then the academy also needs to notify the DFE that they're doing so as well. So DFE has oversight of that, so they understand what risk that they're on the hook for by providing that guarantee. I was on a call a few weeks ago with someone from the DFE and said they're very keen to ensure that academies do notify them where they're providing guarantees, so they have sight of their risk by providing the guarantee. And then under the traditional agreement, both the risk mitigation options available, so indemnity or bond or the guarantor. But what we typically see is, because it costs money to get an indemnity or bond, and actually they are quite difficult to source, especially if it's just for a very small sort of catering or cleaning contractor. It's difficult to source. Insurers and banks may not be interested, and again the costs might be prohibitive. So what we generally see is that the guarantee route is chosen, both the simplicity and cost. Final point to note in terms of risk management is the pension fund, the administering authority, has final approval over what it decides is an appropriate risk management solution. But again, that's something that they'll discuss with you and cover with you as you go through the outsourcing journey and discussions. Just in terms of outsourcing, some other areas to consider, and this comes with a big caveat that I'm not a lawyer, I'm definitely not an outsourcings, legal expert. So what I say here should not be construed as legal advice. You should seek professional legal advice when outsourcing services. This is just some tips, but it probably doesn't cover everything. Firstly, just when thinking about outsourcing, approach to new joiners. You can have what we call open agreements or closed agreements. A closed agreement means that when the staff transfer to the contractor, it's only that group of staff who have access to the LGPS. If the contractor employs someone else who wasn't in scope of the original outsourcing transfer, then they don't have access to the LGPS. And that's traditionally the route that's taken by nearly all outsourcing, is a closed arrangement, because it limits the pension risk and reduces the pensions cost of these outsourcings. You can go down the open route, but it's far less common because of increased uncertainty, increased cost. Secondly, we see is you selected the pensions route, and it's really important that's reflected in the commercial arrangement that's signed between the letting authority and the contractor, to make sure that the commercial arrangement reflects reality. We do see cases every so often where that's not the case, and that can cause significant problems where you've got pension fund arrangements and pension fund costs being derived one way, and not being able to recharge that or claim that back through the commercial agreement, and it falling on the letting authority and increased cost on the letting authority. And then thirdly, think about what pension cost information needs to be provided in tenders. If it's going out to competitive tender, the service, the outsourcing, what you need to provide. And finally, specifically under each of the two routes under pass-through, make sure that the commercial terms and admission agreement are clear about the treatment of exit credits, effectively in pass-through, because none of the risk and liabilities are sitting with the contractor, then they shouldn't have access to any exit credit if there was one. So I think that needs to be made clear. And just thinking about, well, will the contractor be responsible for any of the risks any of the pension funding risks that they control, such as excessive pay growth or early retirement strains, etc., and making sure they're detailed in any commercial arrangement. And then under Route 1, the traditional agreement, if you're going down that route, just being aware, does the contractor really understand all the risks and have they been priced in appropriately? It may see a very competitive looking price, but maybe that they totally haven't grasped the pensions cost and we're just setting ourselves up for issues later on. I suppose just during any outsourcing, any uncertainty, just contact the pension fund straight away. They're there to help and guide you through this process. Nearly on the homeward straight here, just going to finish off talking about emission agreements. I think it's probably something Ali or Vicky will be talking a bit more about after me, because really, but I've mentioned that the contractor joins the fund via an admission agreement, and it is required. A signed admission agreement is required before the contractor can participate in the fund. It's signed by three parties: the administering authority, the letting authority, and the contractor. So that involves maybe 3 sets of lawyers need to see the document beforehand. So the process, it can be time consuming. That's why early engagement is important. And it's really important to get that agreement signed before the transfer of staff. Because if the staff transfer and there's no signed admission agreement in place, then effectively those staff haven't got access to the LGPS at that point. So in theory that they might not have access to the protection benefits that the LGPS offers, such as death in service, ill health, retirement. So it's really important around that, and particularly around issues of auto enrolment, for example. So as I say, early engagement with the pension fund is vital in terms of admission agreements. And that was everything I had to cover today. I hope I haven't waffled on too much, but just to summarise, pension funding implications are a really important part of the outsourcing. The fund's preferred approach is pass through that route too, but you do have the ultimate choice. If you want to make a decision, want to understand it, and with anything to do with outsourcing, just please engage with the pension fund as early as possible. I think I'm passing over to someone.
Yep, so Rob's passing over to Ali now, and if you've got any questions for Rob, if you can start thinking about those and put them into the Q&A, we'll pick them up at the end of the session so that we can clear all those off for you. Thank you. Here's over to Ali.
Yep, great. Thanks, Vicky and Rob. If you'd all just bear with me 2 seconds, I'm just going to share my screen and just talk about the new admissions process in Warwickshire and how we go about getting those admission agreements that Rob just talked about. So if you could just bear with me 2 seconds, I'm going to share my screen and just wait for confirmation that you can all see my slides, which should be up on slideshow now. Just whirring away. Okay, hopefully you can all see that, the new admissions process. So I'm just going to talk briefly about the new admissions process at Warwickshire and how we go about putting some of that information Rob mentioned there into practice, some of the common problems we experience, and then the contact details and all the members of staff you can contact if you have any queries along the way. Okay, so I'll start with what we need from you, so the letting authority. On the surface, it sounds very simple. There's just 2 forms to complete. The first one is a form to complete by the letting authority, so the Academy or Trust. And the second one is an application form which we'll send out to the new contractor or new scheme employer. So that first letting authority form will come to you. That'll be the first contact with the fund, and we'll have all the information we need to go from there. So to go through each form in just a bit more detail, I'll start with the letting authority form. So this must be requested, completed and returned to the fund as soon as possible after the contract is signed. So just to repeat what Rob mentioned there, really, the earlier we have this, the better, because there's a lot of information required on that form, and then there's a lot of work after that form's received. So ideally we get that form requested from you and returned as soon as the tender's won. As soon as you know who's won the contract, who the new employer is going to be, what the terms of the pension agreement are, then we can send the stuff. And this is the first start to get the ball rolling. And so in these bullet points here is just some of the key points that we ask for in that letting authority form that can cause a bit of confusion. In the first instance, we'll ask for a list of members, including pay details. So that's required to go on the admission agreement. We need a list of members for that. We need to update all the relevant members' pension records so that they're all recorded under the same employer. And the scheme actuary will also need a list of the members, so Hyman's will need it in order to calculate the contribution rate if it's a traditional agreement that Rob mentioned. So when I say including pay details there, that means all contributions, pensionable pay up to the last date that they're employed by you, so the day before they move to that contractor. That means the pension records are then up to date at the point of transfer, and when the new contractor takes over, it'll be their responsibility to provide that pay information, and they'll be starting with a clean slate with everything up to date. Another bit of information we asked for on that letting authority form, which Rob just talked about there, the fully funded or the pass-through arrangement. On this is the point where you'll specify which agreement you want to proceed with. So like Rob said, you still have a choice, but the fund's preference here is pass-through. And of course, this will depend on the terms agreed between you and the contractor in the contract. So we do have a lot of confusion about this. I think so. Obviously the pension fund isn't privy to contract negotiations, what's been agreed between you and the contractor. So we're really relying on you as the letting authority to tell us at this point which of these two agreements are needed, because there'll be different actuarial work, different ongoing work after that, depending on the agreement. So yeah, I mean, I'll give you the contact details at the end, but do ask us if you're unsure. But we do rely on you as the letting authority to tell us here which on which basis to proceed. Okay, and the last thing, the easiest of all, is the contact details. So we'll ask for a legal contact from both you and the new employer. We'll need the provider details of the new employer for administration purposes, so we know to contact for business as usual. And we'll also need a payroll contact from you as the letting authority. We just need that payroll contact so we can query any salary information, any salary data you sent over relating to the last day of contract. So just to make sure everything's correct on the date that the employers join the new contractor. Okay, so that's the letting authority form, and the other form is just the new employer application form. So that's what the new contractor will complete and send back once we know about them. It's more or less the same information on there. There's a bit more is required, but generally we'll ask for the same contact details, so a legal contact, an administration contact. We'll ask for confirmation of the members that are transferring to the new employer. So again, we'll have that list of members, and the new contractor will also need to confirm whether it's a pass-through or a bespoke employer contribution rate. So we'll send this form to the contact you put on your letting authority form if we're not contacted in the other way. And the purpose of having both these forms is that we then have a written document as evidence that both the letting authority and the new contractor are aware of the terms, they're aware of the members included, and there won't be any shocks coming when they get the draft admission agreement through with something they weren't expecting. Okay, so once we've got those two forms back, what happens next is where the work starts for the admission agreement for the fund, the legal team, and the actuary. So if a bespoke's required, member data up to the date of transfer will be sent to the scheme actuary, who'll calculate the new scheme employer's contribution rate. So we will run a data extract from our pension system, and we'll upload that securely to the scheme actuaries at Hyman's portal, and they'll then have all the information they need to calculate the open position and the new contract and the new contribution rate for the new employer if it's a bespoke rate. So that's the traditional route that Rob mentioned. And once you have that information back from the actuary, using that information they've supplied, the Warwickshire County Council Legal Department will issue a draft admission agreement to the legal contact specified on your form on the letting authority and new scheme employer form. So that will also go to the fund, so the three legal parties will all see the draft admission agreement at that point. And once that's out, and assuming the contract start date is on the horizon, this just sort of reaffirms what Rob was saying there, that the last point there, the scheme members' pension records will be frozen from the contract start date until the admission agreement is signed. So that's not a permanent freezing, it just means we move the members' pension records from an active status to a pending status. So it can be reopened once the admission agreement has been signed. So just got to show that the quicker that we can have that admission agreement signed, ideally before the contract start date, but as close as possible, there's much less confusion for the members, because what freezing those records means in practice is that those pension scheme members won't be able to receive the pension payments or survivors benefits. They won't be able to request any estimates of their pension in the scheme with any projections, and so they also won't get an annual benefit statement. So that gap between the contract starting and the admission agreement being signed could cause a lot of confusion for the members because they can't access information or pension if they need it. Causes problems for the fund because we can end up with delays in contributions being received, and it also causes confusion for both you, the letting authority, and the new employer because they're not sure what rate they need to be paying or deducting from members' salary. So yeah, just to bring it back to that point, it's really important to get this all agreed really before the contract starts, as close to it, so that we have this information ready to go at the contract start date. And at this point, an invoice will also be issued to the letting authority for the actuarial work. Just a couple of approximate costs here. So a bespoke rate, the traditional route, is usually in the area of £2,000, and then for a pass-through agreement, it's roughly about £750. That will be confirmed, obviously, before the invoice is sent. Okay, so it's a very difficult subject. It's a very confusing area, so there's always going to be confusion. And just want to emphasise that the pension fund are here to help. So if you have any questions, please let us know. You know, we have a team that deal with this directly, and I'll give you the contact details a bit later. So we're here to help on this. But just to give you an idea of some of the things that usually crop up is the main one at the moment is confusion of whether or not a pass-through or a fully funded admission agreement is required. So pass-through or traditional. So where we're not sure of that, we can't really proceed because we can't send the information to the scheme actuary because they can't calculate a risk. We can't send it to the legal department to draft admission agreement. So it really stops the process dead before it gets started. So we as the letting authority, we rely on you to let us know. But if you are stuck, please let us know and we can help in any way we can. And this second point, which is very common as well, is where the pension fund is notified of the new contract after the contract start date. You know, sometimes a good deal of time after it. So then immediately, obviously, the timescales are put back. The fund, the new employers, the letting authority, and the scheme members are all stuck in this limbo where they're not sure about the pension arrangements for this new employer, and obviously just causes more and more confusion along the way. So it's really important, again, that we hear before the contract starts. And we won't go too much detail of this, but of course at the end of the contract then, especially if one contract is finished and it's gone on to a new contractor, not knowing about the new contractor, obviously then that means that we don't know about the end of the previous contract. So we obviously often don't get notification that a previous contract has ended until we're well after the contract end date, at which point we need to backtrack to proceed with cessation arrangements and tracking any cessation payments where they're required. And this last one as well is a common confusion, that people aren't sure where the responsibility for the scheme members lies once that contract signed and that the new employer has taken over that scheme. So I mean, really, until that admission agreement is signed, we will keep coming to you as the letting authority for sort of chasing the information or for looking for clarification, because that's where the responsibility lies until the admission agreement is signed. So yeah, we will still be in contact with you until that admission agreement is signed and those new members have gone over to the new employer. Okay, so that was a brief run through what happens here once we're aware of a new admissions process. These are the contact details that you'll need. Really, those at the top we've got pensions at Warwickshire. That's our general inbox, so you can always email that one. Just underneath that, you've got my email address. So any queries on any stage of the process, you can email me. And there's also Dawn and Katrina, who are the main. They work on admissions as part of the employee relations team, so they'd be the best person to ask if you have any queries with what's happening with any current cases or any future cases coming up. So you've got Dawn and Katrina's email just at the bottom there. And just the final slide from me is the pension fund's website address again if you need it. The forms I mentioned, the letting authority forms and the application form, are on the website, and there'll be some guidance on there as well. So it's the first place to look if you're unsure about the form or where to get it from, or you can email us for a copy. Okay, and so with that, I'll hand back over to Vicky.
Thanks, Sally. And then hopefully, can you see my slides?
Yes, we can, Vicky. Yeah.
Thank you. So I hope you find this morning's presentations useful, so that you can see from the fund's point of view where we're coming at when we're talking to you about how important it is about getting information to the fund before you're doing these outsourcings and making sure that people's benefits are covered and protected. Rob made the point about the difference in the contribution rates that you can choose. So as the letting authority, it's completely up to you. That's what goes into your contract with the new contractor, and we don't have any kind of input into that decision. It is an agreement between you and the contractor. So it's important that you get all the information that you need before that contract is put together. So you know, the costings can be incorporated and understood at the point of the letting and the bid, so that people understand that, you know, what the liabilities are for pensions. Just going to move my slides, so there's a bit of a delay. So I'm basically just going to repeat what Rob and Ali have said about how important it is to let the pension fund know at the very start of the process of outsourcing, you know, to get in touch with us so that we can talk you through the necessary information that we're going to need from you, so that it's all set up ready, so that the members are protected for when that transfer occurs. So what we get quite often is that we will find out about these transfers when it's already happened. Sometimes it's 2 or 3 months after, sometimes it can be longer. And what that means is that those employees that have transferred, they're at high risk of not having the right pension cover in place. And as a fund, we need to also protect the fund from that. If we're not receiving contributions, you know, we can't guarantee the benefits for those members. So again, Ali went through the processes. We're conscious that our forms aren't always the easiest things to fill in. So if you have feedback on the forms that we send out for admissions, please let us know if there's something that doesn't make sense or something that you're not sure about. Ultimately, we are here to support you through the process, to make it as easy as it can be, so that once you've got that contract sorted, we can ensure that the membership it is in place and covered. So when you're thinking about doing an outsourcing, if you can kind of let us know, you know, the service that you're looking to outsource and the members that are affected, the length of the contract. It's really important that we know from the start when that contract is likely to finish, because we can then plan for the work that we need to do when that contract is going to come to an end. Because once it's in place, that's fine, that the contribution rate is sorted, but when it's going to come to an end, we also need to work out obviously the liabilities or what needs to happen with the pension contribution rates and things like that for the new contractor coming in and the old contractor going out. When you're putting your contract together, obviously, if you are looking for a full pension liability arrangement, you'll need to know the cost of that when you're putting the contract together, so that the contractor can build that into their price. Very often, if you've not got that information when the contract is being let, it can be a surprise to contractors, and then it might mean that you need to renegotiate those terms because they haven't factored in the full pension liability rates that they'll need to pay. So it's really important that, again, from the start, you let us know what's going on. Obviously, there is a charge for the work that they actually do for us. Calculating the full liability cost is slightly more expensive than the pass-through arrangement. But obviously, it's your decision to make. You know, we can try to steer you in the direction which creates the less work, you know, the least amount of work for all of us. But ultimately, it is about liability and it is about protection. So it's weighing up the risk, and that's what we have to do as a fund. You know, if we don't have these arrangements in place when contracts are transferred, it means that those members aren't having their pension liabilities paid for whilst there's no contributions coming in. We want to protect the members. We want to make sure that their pensions are protected, and that as the letting authority, you realise your responsibility to ensure that that protection is there, and that those new contractors are fulfilling their duties in making sure that the arrangements are there for pension benefits. So I think, you know, as a fund, what we find is that these can create quite a lot of work for us. There's a lot of chasing, there's a lot of questions about the contract negotiations, about pension liabilities, but ultimately our duty is to make sure the admission agreement is in place and those members are protected, and that we are able to collect the payments from contractors, and that they understand their responsibilities, and everybody is obviously clear. So we are looking to we're always looking at how we can make the process better, and again, as I say, if you've got any feedback on the way that we do the admissions, if there's anything that can make it easier for you, then please let us know. Ali's team obviously deal with the day-to-day work on the admissions, so they're quite happy to give you any advice or information that you'll need. So that's it from me. I hope that this has kind of resonated with you and will help you in the future when you are looking to do any outsourcing. And please bear us in mind at the start. I realise that pensions doesn't very often start at the top of your pile of things to think about, and it's just that you know, we need to make it easier for members. Our job is to protect the members and to protect the fund. So what we're asking is please just make it a consideration that pensions is on at least your checklist of all the things that you have to do. So thank you. So now is your chance to ask any questions and answers. Ask any questions. Sorry, we've still got Rob, Ali online. So if you have got anything that you want to ask, please pop those into the live Q&A box, and we can have a look. So there's no questions and answers coming through. So hopefully we've answered all of your questions through the session. If you do think of anything in the meantime and you want to get in touch with us, Ali's we'll put the slides out and the recording will be available. They have got the contact details on for the pension fund. Yeah, just give us a shout at any time when you're looking to do these outsourcings, because you know, we're happy to help, and we're here to obviously try and make the process easy for you and for the members.